Welcome to Unit 7, Lesson 2, Westward Expansion, the Lewis and Clark Expedition. Lewis and Clark's expedition cleared up some of the geographic unknowns of the new, expansive lands that President Jefferson bought from France. The Louisiana Purchase. Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of France, had a problem. In 1803, he needed money to fight a war with Britain. He did not want to borrow money from any European country or bank. He turned his eyes to the United States. He knew the United States needed access to the French port of New Orleans in America, so he blockaded the port and refused to allow American ships to use it. He knew that the United States would send negotiators to France to work out a deal, and they did. Thomas Jefferson was president at the time. He told negotiators to buy a piece of the port of New Orleans for $10 million. That was a lot of money. No one expected a problem. Napoleon shocked the negotiators. He refused their offer of $10 million. Instead, for $15 million, Napoleon offered to sell the United States government all of the French land known as Louisiana. Back then, Louisiana was bigger than it is today. It stretched from New Orleans all the way to Canada. Louisiana, if purchased, would double the size of the United States. Napoleon offered this vast amount of land for a mere 3 cents an acre. It remains even today as the best real estate deal in history. You would think Congress would grab at this, but Jefferson had quite a job talking Congress into it. For one thing, the United States would have to borrow money from European banks to pay for it. For another, it was just so huge. But Jefferson was good at talking Congress into things. In 1803, they finally said yes. The question then was, now what? No one had any idea what was in there. They knew there had to be a few trappers and possibly some settlers, both French and Spanish, maybe Native Americans. Jefferson believed the first step was to figure out what they had bought. Lewis and Clark. Jefferson asked Lewis and Clark to explore the territory for new trade, map it, and see if there was a waterway to the Pacific Ocean. The journey would also establish an American claim to the Northwest. Today, St. Louis, Missouri, is called the Gateway to the West. On May 14, 1804, the expedition left St. Louis heading up the Missouri River. Together with over 40 men, Lewis and Clark started their trip with a large barge and 2 smaller boats. The explorers faced problems with some of the people they met along the way, but in reality, the mission would have failed if not for the help and kindness that other Native Americans provided. 15-year-old Sacagawea joined the team as an interpreter. The fact that she brought her newborn child made the group seem less threatening to some of the people they met. Here's a quick video about Sacagawea.
You might think you know a lot about Native Americans through popular movies, books, and classes in school, but it turns out that a lot of what we think we know about famous Native American figures isn't quite right. Take Sacagawea, for example. You probably remember her as a beautiful Indian woman who lived an exotic life, serving as the all-knowing guide for Lewis and Clark's famous expedition, right? Well, that's not exactly how it happened. Not much is known about Sacagawea's early childhood, but we do know that she was born in 1788 into the Agatica tribe of the Lemhi Shoshone in what is now Idaho. In 1800, when she was about 12 years old, Sacagawea and several other girls were kidnapped by a group of Hidatsu Indians. She was taken as a captive to a Hidatsu village in present-day North Dakota. Then she was sold to a French-Canadian fur trapper named Toussaint Charbonneau. Within a year or so, she was pregnant with their first child. Soon after she became pregnant, the Corps of Discovery arrived near the Hidatsu villages. Captains Meriwether Lewis and William Clark built Fort Mandan there and then started interviewing people to help guide them on their perilous expedition. They agreed to hire Sacagawea's husband, Charbonneau, with the understanding that his lovely wife would also come along as an interpreter. They figured her very presence would help any encounters with native tribes along the way. As Clark noted in his journal, A woman with a party of men is a token of peace. Shortly thereafter, Sacagawea gave birth to a little boy named Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau. Clark called him Pompey. She carried Pompey on a board strapped to her back as the Corps of Discovery forged on. Besides interpreting the language when Lewis and Clark encountered Indians, Sacagawea's activities as a member of the Corps included digging for roots, collecting edible plants, and picking berries. In 1805, the boat they were riding in was capsized. She dove into the water, recovering all the important papers and supplies that would otherwise have been lost, including the journals and records of Lewis and Clark. Later that year, Captain Lewis and 3 men scouted 75 miles ahead of the expedition's main party, crossing the Continental Divide. The next day, they encountered a group of Shoshones. Not only did they prove to be Sacagawea's band, but their leader, Chief Kameawait, turned out to be her very own brother. After 5 years of separation since her kidnapping as a young girl, Sacagawea and Kameawait had an emotional reunion. Unfortunately, she quickly had to bid farewell to her beloved brother and continue on with the journey. At one point, the expedition became so difficult and freezing, the group was reduced to eating candles to survive. When temperatures finally became more bearable, Sacagawea found, dug, and cooked roots to help the group regain their strength. On the return trip, they encountered an Indian wearing a beautiful fur robe. Lewis and Clark wanted to bring the robe to Thomas Jefferson as a gift, but had nothing to trade for it. So, Sacagawea agreed to trade her most precious possession, her beaded belt, for the fur. A little over 2 years after the expedition began, it was finally over, ending in St. Louis. Today, we learn about Sacagawea in school as a heroic guide, but her life, like most everyone's, was much more complicated than history books sometimes give her credit for.
The team followed the Missouri River to its headquarters in present-day Montana. From there, they crossed the Rocky Mountains where they connected to the Clearwater River, the Snake River, and the Columbia River. They reached the Pacific Ocean near what is now Portland, Oregon, in November of 1805. The journey took about a year and a half. The return trip home only took 6 months. In total, they crossed over 8,000 miles on the journey. Unlike other exploration trips, Lewis and Clark only lost one team member of their Corps of Discovery group, Sergeant Charles Floyd. His appendix burst. Many men had become ill on the trip, and they recovered. He was the only one who died. The men on the trip were incredibly lucky. Lewis and Clark returned to Jefferson with maps of the territory, scientific data gathered about new plants, animals, and natural resources, as well as information about the Native Americans already living in the Louisiana Territory. It was the beginning of a new era in the United States, the era of Western expansion. Just a quick review before we end this video. In 1803, Thomas Jefferson, president at the time, sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to find a water route to the Pacific Ocean and explore the uncharted West. Lewis and Clark's Corps of Discovery traveled almost 8,000 miles from St. Louis, Missouri to the Pacific Ocean, then back to St. Louis. Few accurate maps of the West existed back then, and there were many geographic unknowns about the region. They found about 300 species unknown to science, nearly 50 Indian tribes, and the Rocky Mountains. That's all for today's video.